was the kind of night that got under your skin. October had settled over Lancaster County, Nebraska, with an eerie stillness, the kind that made you feel like the whole world was holding its breath. My patrol car cruised down the empty streets, the headlights cutting through the thick mist that clung to the ground like ghostly fingers. I had been on the force for nearly a decade, but nights like these still made me uneasy. Maybe it was the quiet, the absolute stillness of the town at this hour. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that whispered to my gut, something isn't right. At 1:47 a.m., my radio crackled to life, shattering the silence. "Officer, please, I think someone's in my house." The voice was strained, barely above a whisper, but the fear in it was unmistakable. I gripped the radio. "Sir, stay calm." "What's your address?" A pause. Then the man gave an address on Hollow Creek Road, a place I knew well, or at least I thought I did. "Can you see them? Do you know who they are?" Silence, just rapid, shallow breathing. Then, just as he was about to say something else, the line cut off. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I pulled up the address on my onboard system. My stomach twisted. There shouldn't be a house there. That stretch of road had been nothing but empty farmland for decades. But I had heard the fear in his voice, and fear didn't lie. I arrived at Hollow Creek Road within minutes. My headlights swept over an empty stretch of land. No house, no lights, just miles of open fields. I checked the address again. No mistake, this was the spot. A single farmhouse stood farther down the road, its porch light flickering. If someone had seen something, it would be them. I pulled up, stepped out, and knocked on the door. After a few moments, it creaked open, revealing Lucas Reed, a 50-something man with deep lines on his face and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much. "Sorry to bother you, sir," I said, keeping my tone even. "I got a call from a house near here. A man sounded like he was in trouble, but I gestured behind me, to the empty fields." "There's no house." Lucas frowned. "There hasn't been a house here for 30 years. A chill crawled up my spine. "Are you sure?" "Positive." He hesitated, eyes darting past me toward the road. "You should leave, officer." I didn't like that. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. I nodded, thanked him, and made my way back to my patrol car. As I slid into the driver's seat, something in my gut told me to check the back, but when I turned, I saw nothing but the dark, empty seat. Shaking off the unease, I started the engine. The low hum of the car was strangely comforting. I reached for the radio to report the call as a false alarm, and then I saw it. A shadowy figure in the back seat. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. Someone was sitting behind me. The figure was hunched forward, just a dark shape in the rearview mirror. I couldn't see its face, but I knew. I knew it was watching me. I went for my gun. My fingers barely grazed the holster before. A searing pain exploded at the base of my skull. A force like a sledgehammer crashed into my head. The world spun. My vision blurred. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was a pair of glinting eyes staring at me in the mirror. I woke up to the harsh glow of hospital lights. My head throbbed with each heartbeat. My mouth was dry. The steady beeping of machines was the only sound in the room. A nurse rushed over when she saw me stirring. "Take it easy, Officer Carter. You've had a rough night." Rough didn't begin to cover it. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my skull. "What? What happened?" My voice was hoarse, foreign to my own ears. "You were found unconscious in your patrol car," she said gently, "near Hollow Creek Road." My stomach twisted. Was there anyone else?" She hesitated. "No, just you." A cold weight settled in my chest. "No one else?" Before I could ask more, the door opened and two of my fellow officers walked in, Deputy Mark Ramsey and Sergeant Phil Dawson. Their faces were tight, unreadable. "We found you slumped over the wheel," Mark said. The car was still running. No sign of a struggle, no footprints outside. "Just you." I stared at them. "What about the man who called?" "The address he gave me." Phil exchanged a glance with Mark. "Carter." There's no house there. There never was. I shook my head, the pain slicing through me. No. I spoke to him. I heard his voice. Phil sighed. We checked the number. No record of it. No calls came in at that time. The words hit me like a bullet. No call. No house. No attacker. I knew what I had seen. What I had felt. The breath on my neck. The weight of something shifting in the back seat. But looking at their faces, I knew they didn't believe me. And maybe in some small, terrifying way, I didn't believe it either. The memories slipped like smoke through my fingers. The harder I tried to grasp them, the faster they faded. Days passed. I told myself it was exhaustion, that my mind had played tricks on me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The shadow in the back seat. The glint of those eyes in the mirror. I returned to Hollow Creek Road a week later, just to see, just to prove to myself that it was nothing. But when I got there, the land was just as empty, just as quiet. Except for one thing. A single deep indentation in the dirt where my car had been, and beside it, a long, dark smudge, like someone had been sitting there, waiting. I wish I could say the incident at Hollow Creek Road was just a bad dream, that I could wake up, shake it off, and go back to the dull routine of small-town police work, but that wasn't how it worked. The shadow in the back seat, the missing house, the voice on the radio that never existed, it lingered in my mind like a stain I couldn't scrub off. Every time I sat in my patrol car, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, expecting to see something there. I told myself I needed to move on. Needed a case that was grounded, something real to pull me out of the fog of whatever the hell had happened that night. But I wasn't prepared for what came next. The call came in at 9:42 p.m. All units requesting immediate backup at 418 Holloway Street, Ashwood Apartments. Female suspect, armed with a knife, refusing to vacate the premises. Officers on scene report erratic behavior. I was still in the precinct, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee when the radio crackled to life. Across the table, Dylan Foster glanced up. He was part of our K9 unit, ex-military, built like a truck and someone who had seen more than his fair share of bad nights. He looked at me, raised an eyebrow, and said, "Guess we're up." We pulled up to Ashwood Apartments 10 minutes later. The place was falling apart. Broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, and the sour stench of piss and mildew lingering in the air. A small crowd had gathered outside, murmuring, watching the fourth-floor window. "She's been standing there for hours," a man in a stained hoodie muttered. "Not moving, just staring." I looked up. A single dim light glowed from one of the windows. A figure stood just beyond the glass, motionless. Something about it made my skin crawl. Inside, the hallway was lined with other officers. A younger cop, barely out of training, filled us in. "She won't come out. Won't talk, just holding the knife and staring at the wall." Dylan and I exchanged a glance. We had both been in enough bad situations to know this one felt off. He stepped forward and knocked. "Mrs. Crawley, this is the police. We're here to assist you, but we need you to put the knife down and come out peacefully." No response. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. Not just the absence of sound, but that thick, suffocating quiet that makes your instincts scream something isn't right. I gave the signal. 2 officers kicked in the door. And then we saw her. The apartment was a wreck. Stale air, the metallic scent of something burned, wallpaper peeling in strips. But the worst part was her. Hannah Crowley stood in the middle of the room. She was wearing a tattered nightgown, her hair a tangled mess. Her face was pale, gaunt, almost hollow, and her eyes, Christ, her eyes, empty. She wasn't looking at us. Wasn't even reacting to the cops who had just stormed into her home. She just stood there, knife clutched in both hands, breathing slowly. "Mrs. Crowley," I tried again. "You need to put the knife down." No response. Not a single muscle twitched. Then the smell hit me. Rot. Burnt metal. I gagged. It was rancid, thick in the air like a fog. Dylan grimaced too. Even Brutus, his Malinois, let out a low, uneasy growl. Something in my gut told me to get the hell out. Then she moved. 1 second she was still, the next she lunged. I barely registered the motion before the blade sank into Dylan's shoulder. Blood bloomed across his uniform as he stumbled back, teeth clenched against the pain. I went for my gun, but I wasn't fast enough. A shot rang out. Hannah staggered. A red stain spread across her chest. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. She collapsed, the knife slipping from her fingers as she hit the floor. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Dylan gasped, pressing a hand to his wound. "I'm fine," he muttered, though the way he was swaying on his feet told me otherwise. But I wasn't looking at him anymore. I was looking at the wall behind Hannah. Hundreds of photographs, newspaper clippings, some yellowed with age, others torn from recent issues. Faces of police officers, names, notes scribbled in red ink, and in the very center, a picture of Dylan. His face was circled over and over and over again. My stomach dropped. Dylan had seen it too. His expression was unreadable, his breathing shallow. "Let's get the hell out of here," he muttered. And we did. But as we walked out, I couldn't shake the feeling that Hannah Crawley had been waiting for us, for him. And that whatever this was, whatever she was, it wasn't over. I wish I could say the case with Hannah Crowley ended that night. That after the ambulance took Dylan away, after we bagged her body and combed through her deranged collection of police photos, I could shake off the feeling that something was watching us. But I couldn't. Because as much as I wanted to chalk it up to just another mentally unstable individual losing control, something about the way she stared at Dylan's picture, something about the way she waited for us, made my skin crawl. It felt orchestrated, like we had stepped into a story already written for us. And that's why, when I got the call about the house on Marshall Street, I already knew before I even arrived that this wasn't going to be a normal night. 1:30 a.m. Another late patrol, another quiet stretch of road. Seattle was drenched in fog, the kind that made the streetlights look like dying embers in the distance. I had been in the force long enough to know that this kind of silence was deceptive. The city wasn't asleep, it was just waiting. I turned onto Marshall Street, my headlights washing over rows of modest houses, all tucked into their shadows, but the one on the corner, that one, didn't belong. It looked out of place, like it had been forgotten by time. Peeling paint, broken windows, a roof sagging in defeat. I slowed down. Something moved behind the second-floor window, a shape, a silhouette. I stopped the car, heart already thudding. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring down at me. Then the scream cut through the night, a woman's scream. I was out of the car before I even registered grabbing my gun. I called it in. Possible breaking and entering, possible hostage situation, and sprinted up the cracked steps. The front door was ajar. The smell hit me first. Stale air, damp wood, and something else. Something metallic. Blood. I pushed the door open with my foot, gun raised. The house swallowed me whole. The inside was worse. Dust coated everything, untouched for years. The furniture was covered in yellowed sheets. The kind of place that hadn't been lived in for decades, and yet, someone was here tonight. The floor groaned under my boots as I moved deeper inside. The scream had come from upstairs. I kept my back to the wall as I climbed the narrow staircase, my breath shallow. My flashlight cut through the thick dark, revealing warped floorboards and peeling wallpaper. And then I saw her. A woman, tied to a chair in the middle of the room. Her clothes were torn. Her wrists bound so tight the skin had started to bruise. A rag was stuffed in her mouth, muffling the small whimpers escaping her throat. Her eyes, wild, desperate, locked onto mine. I rushed forward, holstering my gun. Hey, I got you," I said, pulling the gag from her mouth. She gasped, her breath ragged. "He's here," she choked out. "He's watching." I froze. Then I heard it. A creak. Not from the floor under us, from below. I pulled out my radio. This is Officer Hale. I've got a victim in the house. Possible abduction. Suspect may still be inside. But my radio crackled uselessly. Dead air. The woman, Elaine Brooks, was trembling. He's been watching me for months, she whispered. I didn't believe him, thought he was just some creep. Then he took me. I cut through the ropes binding her hands. Who? She swallowed hard. Nathan Wells. That name, it sent ice straight through my veins. I had heard it before. A former classmate of Elaine's, someone she had brushed off in college, thinking he was just another socially awkward guy. But he hadn't moved on. He had followed her, and now he had her here. A shuffling sound echoed from downstairs. My grip on my gun tightened. I grabbed Elaine's arm, pulling her behind me. We're getting out of here, I whispered. Step by step, we moved down the stairs, my pulse hammering. The front door was still open, if we could just make it out. Then I saw him, standing in the hallway just beyond the front door. Nathan Wells. He didn't run, didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly. In the dim light, his eyes were empty, like Hannah Crowley's. I leveled my gun at him. Get on the ground, now. A slow, curling smile spread across his face. You came, he murmured. I knew you would. Elaine let out a strangled sob behind me. Nathan didn't move, didn't even blink. My finger tightened on the trigger. I said, get on the ground. And then the lights flickered. The air in the house shifted, heavy, suffocating. For a second, I swore I heard whispering. Nathan exhaled softly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he smiled again, this time wider. You don't understand, he whispered. This place doesn't let go. I had had enough. I surged forward, grabbing him, twisting his arms behind his back. He didn't resist, didn't fight, just laughed. Even as I shoved him outside, even as backup finally arrived, he kept laughing. And the worst part? As I turned to look back at the house, the upstairs window was no longer empty. A shadow stood there, watching. Nathan was taken into custody without incident. Elaine was safe. On paper, the case was closed. But I couldn't stop thinking about his last words. This place doesn't let go. I went back the next night, just to see, just to prove to myself it was just another house, that there was nothing there. But when I got to the corner of Marshall Street, the house was gone. No peeling paint, no broken windows, no sagging roof, just an empty lot, as if it had never been there at all. If there's one thing these stories have taught me, it's this. We don't always get the answers we want. Sometimes the world doesn't play by our rules. It doesn't care for logic or reason. It doesn't care if something makes sense. It simply is. I've spent years in law enforcement, dealing with everything from violent criminals to the truly deranged. But there are things out there that don't fit neatly into a case file, things that slip between the cracks of what we call reality. And those are the ones that keep you up at night. Let's look back at what happened. In the first story, I followed a call that shouldn't have existed to a house that wasn't there. Yet, something was there, something that left me unconscious in my car with no explanation. I still don't know what called me that night or what was waiting for me in the back seat, and maybe I never will. The second case? It should have been simple. A woman refusing to leave her apartment. But Hannah Crawley wasn't just a woman with a knife. She had been waiting for us. And somehow, she knew exactly who Dylan Foster was before he even stepped foot in that room. What force was guiding her actions? Was it madness? Or something else entirely? And finally, the house on Marshall Street. The house that wasn't there the next night. We rescued Elaine, we arrested Nathan Wells, but what truly haunted me was what he said. This place doesn't let go. He knew something I didn't. He knew that house, that presence, was never really gone. So what can you take away from all of this? 1. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if that tiny voice in your head is telling you to leave, listen to it. Instincts exist for a reason. Don't ignore them. 2. Not everything can be explained. We like to think we have control. 3. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Curiosity is natural. We all want to understand the unknown. But be careful. Some things don't want to be found, and some places don't like being disturbed. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. At Enigma of the Unknown, we tell these stories not just to scare you, but to remind you. The world is stranger than you think, and sometimes it's better that way. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with your friends. Your support keeps us going, and we promise there are more stories to come. Until next time, stay safe. And if you ever see something in your rearview mirror that shouldn't be there, don't look too long.